The introduction of the Panzer III Ausf into service provided the Germans with a base for the development of a good medium tank. While the Germans were generally satisfied with the overall concept and design, there was still a lot of room for improvements and modifications. The greatest issue with the Ausf was its weak suspension. Thus, the Germans introduced a new version, the Ausf, intended to improve the suspension and other minor elements of the vehicle. Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host, Stan, now under an even thicker blanket because apparently the last one didn't cut noise enough. And if you like tanks and want to discuss more, if you have any questions, join our Discord server where you can talk with all of our team and also hang out with us. We'll gladly answer questions and help with research as far as we can. There's a link in the description. See you there. Following the introduction of the Panzer III Ausf, the Germans established a good design base that still offered a lot of space for improvements. As Daimler-Benz was finishing the first few Ausf test chassis in August of 1935, Waffenprüfwesen 6, Waffenprüf 6, the automotive design office of the German army, issued a new contract by which 2 additional experimental chassis were to be built. These were the Zugfahrgestell, experimental chassis, Zugführerwagen, platoon commander's vehicle, 3 and 4. The ZW3 experimental vehicle would serve as the base for the development of the Panzer III Ausf, while the ZW4 would become the Ausf C and D. The development of these versions was mainly focused on solving the issues regarding the Ausf's problematic suspension. According to this contract, Daimler-Benz was to produce 15 Panzer III Ausf chassis and superstructures by the end of 1937. These had serial numbers ranging from 60201 to 60215. As the German industry was still not sufficiently developed for tank production, a number of subcontractors were also included in the Panzer III project. These included Krupp Grusenwerk, producing 5 new turrets, Rheinmetall, building 5 of the 3.7 cm guns, and Krupp Essen, building another 10 turrets and 5 guns. Additionally, Stahlwerke Harcourt-Eichen was to produce armor components for the needed turrets. Once all parts were completed, these were to be transported to Daimler-Benz for final assembly. By early November 1937, 8 vehicles were completed and were mostly issued to tank training schools. The last 2 vehicles were completed and delivered by the start of December 1937. The whole of the Panzer III Ausf had the same arrangement as its previous version, with the rear engine compartment, central crew compartment, and forward-mounted transmission and enclosed driving compartment. The only visible change introduced on the Ausf's hull was the use of 2 inspection round hatches placed in front of the transmission. These were used for the crew to have better access to the transmission during repairs. There were several changes incorporated into the new Ausf's superstructure. The major one was the complete redesign of the rear engine compartment. It was enlarged and the 2 larger air intakes were replaced with 4 smaller ones placed on top of the engine compartment instead of the rear. On the left superstructure side, a triangular-shaped pivoting arm was added. Its main purpose was to serve as a machine gun mount for the crew to engage enemy aircraft. The vehicle had to be stationary, which somewhat limited its usefulness. Basically, someone had to get out with the machine gun, put it on the pivoting arm on the side of the vehicle, and then stand on the ground and shoot at the planes. I understand the idea of shooting at the flyboys, but maybe this wasn't the best way to do it. The radio antenna and its wooden housing were moved further to the back on the right side of the superstructure. The Panzer III Ausf received a new commander's cupola that was bolted to the rear of the top of the turret. It still had the same drum shape and 8 small vision slits. In order to provide better protection for the commander from bullet splash, the internal armored slide slits were improved. These could be partially and completely opened to provide the commander a good view of the surroundings. The 12mm thick glass blocks were also present on this cupola. The commander direction indicator was kept unchanged, and the most obvious change to the cupola was the introduction of new two-part hatches. The major improvement, in contrast to the Ausf A version, was the introduction of a completely new and somewhat complicated suspension. The Ausf B suspension consisted of 8 small road wheels. These were placed in pairs on double swing axles, which pivoted around a swing arm. This swing arm also pivoted on a pin that was held in position by a small metal box which was welded on the hull's lower sides. Above each group of 4 wheels, a leaf spring unit was installed. In addition, there were also 4 shock absorbers placed on each side of the suspension. While the front drive sprocket and rear idler were unchanged, the Ausf B had free return rollers in comparison to the 2 used on the Ausf A. The engine used on this vehicle was the same H.L. 108TR, which produced 250 horsepower at 2,800 RPM, the same as on the Ausf A. While the weight of the Ausf B was increased by a ton, its overall driving performance remained mostly the same, with a maximum speed of 35 km per hour or 10 to 12 cross-country, and an operational range of 165 km or 95 cross-country. There were some internal engine modifications, like rearranging positions of the filler tanks to provide better cooling. The armor protection of the hull and the turret were also left unchanged. They still provided limited protection, as armor thickness ranged from 5 to 16 mm only, which was just bulletproof. The Panzer III Ausf B also had a crew of 5, which included the commander, gunner and loader positioned in the turret, and the driver and radio operator in the hull. Their positions were unchanged in comparison to the previous model. The main armament of the Panzer III Ausf B was also unchanged, and it consisted of the 3.7 cm Kampfwagen Kanone L46.5 with 121 rounds of ammunition. Secondary armament consisted of 3 7.92mm MG34 machine guns, with 2 placed in a coaxial configuration with the main gun and 1 in the hull. The machine gun ammunition load was 4,500 rounds. The first 8 built Panzer III Ausf B were ready for distribution by August of 1937. 6 of these would be given to the Putlos Tank Training School. The remaining 2 would be given to the 5th Panzer Regiment. The last 2 vehicles built, when completed, were allocated to the 1st Panzer Regiment at the end of 1937. Despite being built in small numbers, the Panzer III Ausf B would see some action during the war. The Germans were forced to use some Panzer III Ausf Bs for the invasion of Poland in 1939. The majority, if not all, of the Ausf B vehicles that were damaged or required a major overhaul were retired from service and instead given to training units after February of 1940. While necessary components to complete 15 Panzer III Ausf B vehicles were built, only 10 fully operational tanks were actually assembled. The remaining 5 turrets and chassis were actually reused for other purposes. In June of 1936, Inspectorate 4, which was in charge of artillery development, issued a request for the development of a self-propelled assault vehicle that was to support infantry formations. Krupp was charged with the development of the main weapon, while Daimler-Benz did the chassis and superstructure. 5 vehicles would be built using soft steel but with fully operational weapons, based on the Panzer III Ausf B hull. Due to many delays in production, these would not be completed until October of 1939. These would be used in the following years for testing and crew training. Eventually, these developments would give way to the famous Sturmgeschütz series. With the allocation of the 5 Panzer III Ausf B chassis to the Sturmgeschütz Free project, 5 turrets were left unused. In order not to waste them, the Heereswaffenamt gave Daimler-Benz instructions to build 5 Ausf D chassis to be merged with the Ausf B turrets. These were never a priority, and Daimler-Benz concentrated on developing and building more improved versions of the Panzer III. It took some 2 years until October of 1940 to actually complete these vehicles. Some of these, possibly all, were transported to Norway in the summer of 1941 and allocated to the Panzerabteilung ZBV 40. The Panzer III Ausf B was the first attempt to improve some shortcomings of the Ausf A. While it introduced a new suspension, a weak point on the previous version, it also proved to be somewhat overcomplicated and unsuited for the job. Nevertheless, the Panzer III Ausf B was still an important vehicle in German hands, as it provided them with a necessary increase of experience in tank design and, more importantly, in crew training. And that concludes this video. You can find other articles and more information regarding the Panzer III Ausf B on our website. Ratings, comments, and subscriptions would be greatly appreciated. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit. We also have a link to our Discord community server in the description below, so join us. If you would like to help us continue and refine our work, also consider donating on our Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.